Good afternoon, everybody. It's Maynard, Mike, Matt, and Colin, and we're really excited today about a session that I want to preemptively call Texas Sustainability. We talk about sustainability in so many contexts in today's world. Today is going to be about the great state of Texas, how it got great, and how to keep it great. We're particularly excited to have Dick Weekley with us and Ryan Dumais. Ryan works with Dick. Dick is a guy who needs no introduction in Houston. He's a businessman, philanthropist, is a native Houstonian. He's done so many things for the city and the state. And we're particularly excited today. He's going to talk about Texans for lawsuit reform, but a number of other things that he's been involved with over the years that have to do with keeping Texas the great pro-business place that it is. So welcome, Dick. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you, Maynard. Happy to be here.
And Ryan, thank you too. We got two SMU grads on the phone at the same time. That's good for us. All right, well, let's kick it off. Mike Bradley, what's happening in the markets today? I know we had a lot of earnings, a lot of chatter about rates going up, not going up. What's happening?
Yeah, Maynard, the market's kind of going sideways because of a couple things. First of all, you had over the weekend, Warren Buffett had his annual shareholders meeting. He basically talked about a variety of things, but one of the things he hinted at is inflation across a lot of the businesses that he has. And that kind of is different than what we're hearing from the Fed. The Fed's keeping rates pretty low. Everyone knows there's inflation out there. You see it every day. Yellen came out today or yesterday and said that interest rates are probably biased higher. So I think everyone's waiting for the Fed to finally admit there is inflation out there. We're going to act. And so I think the market's just kind of going to go sideways for a while until we figure this out. Now, as it relates, to what we do, 2 weeks ago, we had the oil service earnings in full gear. Last week, it was really the oil majors. And this week, it's all about the E&Ps. And what are the E&Ps saying? I think what we're seeing is, we saw a deal last night, a consolidation deal, an asset sale. I think we're going to continue to see that. And I think every company that talked today said that they fully expect there's going to be consolidation, and they probably are going to participate in consolidation. So that's not a surprise. The one thing I do think I also heard from several calls today is that, this message of OPEC has a lot of supply off the market. They're artificially inflating the market higher. And until that, basically, those barrels come back to market, they're not going to look to increase production. They're going to be more of a maintenance level. And any excess free cash flow is going to go back to shareholders. And you know what? That's a great message. That's a message we want to send. In 2022, maybe we start to talk about growth again. But right now, through 21, that is the message that needs to be sent. And it's coming through loud and clear. Is it kind of going through in the stocks yet? No, it's not showing through the stocks yet, which is perplexing, to say the least. But I think that's more to do with the market just generally saying, we don't know what's going on with rates. We don't know what's going on with inflation. In the meantime, we're just going to sit on the sidelines. But guess what? Our group is in great shape, and they're getting free cash flow higher than we expected, sooner than we expected. Balance sheets are getting better than expected. It's going to lead to consolidation. And so I think things look really, really good. The setup, we've said this for the last 4, 5, 6 months, that the setup looks fantastic for energy. We're not backing off that. It looks great.
Okay. Mike, you're kind of coming out swinging today. I like it. Matt, what's on your mind? I know you're looking at not just all the energy stocks, but a lot of the other things going on.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the inflation theme. It's actually something that's quite interesting in the automotive sector. We saw one of the big OEMs last week report. We know there's a semi shortage going on in the sector at the moment, and that was going to start to have an impact on production in Q1 and Q2. It looks like that shortage is actually more acute. So what we are going to see is some of the largest auto manufacturers in the U.S. are going to materially reduce production volumes in the second quarter. That's really interesting in the fact that you're basically going to set up for a situation where inventory levels at the dealership level are being depleted. That means that they're getting better pricing power, so they're offering fewer incentives to consumers, which means that the price for buying a new automobile is headed higher, and that's partially offsetting some of the production losses. But at the same time, what we're seeing is very strong demand for used cars, and used car pricing is actually up 12 to 14% quarter over quarter, and that's showing up in the inflation data as well. So the automotive space is going through a transitory issue with semiconductors, but you're also seeing strong demand from retail come back, which over the medium term bodes well for our views around the gasoline side of the equation. And then this is something that you may actually see as a bit of a structural shift in the industry. I think one thing we saw in the upstream space as we kind of came through the downturn here was really consolidating, cutting costs, focusing on free cash flow generation. You're seeing that thematically from the legacy OEMs. They're cutting back on productive capacity globally. They're cutting out low margin vehicles. They're focusing on pricing power, and they're focusing on consumer demand. I think ultimately that leads to a healthier market for the automotive manufacturers, but what it's also going to lead to in the next 12 to 18 months is probably some cost inflation. So if you're out in the market today buying a new car or a used car, basically expect to pay more over the next 6 to 12 months for those vehicles.
Hey, Matt, on this inflation question, you talked to so many investors in the course of the week. Have you talked to an investor in the last 3 or 4 weeks that said to you, no way, I don't think we're going to have inflation, and here's why? Like, are those, I'm just wondering, is that person out there? Because it seems like we're all thinking it.
No, I don't think they are. I mean, it's pretty hard, whether you're looking at Collins chip indicator, or you're looking at the housing market, or you're looking at things like the commodity sector. Corn and soybean prices are hitting very high levels, or you're looking at oil and gas. I mean, everything across the globe is inflating. And then obviously we're talking about things like autos, even in chems. I mean, the chem space is on fire. I saw some articles out talking about the chlorine market having shortages here. So for those looking for tablets for your pool this summer, you're going to be paying a lot more. So inflation is real. Inflation seems to be here to stay, at least for some time. Most of the clients, I think, back to Mike's question on why aren't we seeing more of a bid in the energy stocks, I think a little of that is just the broader concern on the backwardation of the curve. So we obviously have a pretty backwardated crude curve. So as that continues to improve, I think we should see a better bid in the equities. And on top of that, there's still some uncertainties out there. You've got the Iran risk on the supply front. We're still a little bit uncertain around how the privates will respond in 2022. So at the end of the day, I think Mike hit it on the head. The capital allocation decisions from the public the public companies is putting us in a great position here to outperform over the next 12 to 24 months. And as these concerns die down, because we think a lot of those are somewhat inflated, I think the oil and gas equities are still set up for a nice run here over the next 6 to 12 months.
All right, that's great. Thank you, Matt. All right, Colin, I know you've got something exciting to add to all that, and maybe to start leading into today's discussion, but let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, I guess picking up on that last point, Maynard, when you have Mohamed El-Erian and a lot of the institutional investors saying inflation is going to be durable, I think that really is a message that we need to listen to. And I thought it was interesting, as Mike said, when Janet Yellen today apparently forgot that she's the Treasury Secretary, not sitting at the Federal Reserve, and oops, said something you're not supposed to say when you're the Secretary of the Treasury. So, I think also, though, it's important to keep in mind that when you're in a structural inflation environment, it doesn't necessarily mean that prices only go one way, up. It means there's a general tendency to lift all boats. And that's why it's so pernicious for value and why you really don't want to get into too large an inflationary environment. But let me show you a couple of charts where maybe we're starting to hit some road bumps, at least in the near term, for price. This is a picture we've shown several times in recent weeks. It's the CO2 emissions allowance price from the ICE Futures Exchange. It's a candle chart. If you're not familiar with reading these technical charts, today we got this black box. And what's important about that is if you scan over here to the left, you can see that in dollar terms, we, for the first time, have hit $60 per metric ton, and we're beginning to see a technical indicator that would suggest that maybe we move to the downside next. And this is something that we've picked up also in relative strength indicators, another technical measurement of relative performance on price momentum. And ahead of the recent small pullback, not particularly large in the S&P 500, we've gotten to the 70 level by this metric, the 14-day RSI, 63.32 as of yesterday. Why is that important? Well, typically when you get to 70, that signifies that you're overbought, or that at least there's kind of a general perception that you've gone too far too fast, and maybe it's time to take a pause. And if you look at the S&P Goldman Sachs Commodities Index, it's at 70.16. NYMEX Natural Gas, 71.62. ICE UK Natural Gas, 74.5. corn above 80. These are all the prompt contracts. Now, there are good reasons for corn to be having this very strong momentum. There is a true tight stocks to use ratio, but there really isn't such a tight stocks to use situation in ultra low sulfur diesel or crude. And so while these numbers at 62 and 57 suggest that we still have some upside momentum, and indeed we are bullish for all the reasons Mike just said, it's something to keep an eye on, particularly as copper, which has really been one of the bellwethers in this commodity market, along with lumber and some of the others, is also getting to 70. Bottom line here, probably some more room in the near term, but let's not forget that just because we have a backwardated curve and some local supply tightness, that somehow we can't have OPEC suddenly change its mind and allow barrels back into the marketplace. When we look at the vol smile in NYMEX WTI, the puts have been steepening again relative to the calls. The put skew is steepening not only in the prompt contract, but also in the June 2022, the 25 deltas are at 9 vols. Now, what's interesting about that is the calls are pretty well bid. So again, more evidence that Mike's view as a strategist is correct. The market is saying, pay attention to this. The Dees $60 calls surpassed $8 per barrel today. And so we have an interesting situation, kind of a bullish medium-term outlook where people are buying calls, feeling good about the world, but also, picking up some protection when they can, particularly in the prompt contracts. Now, all of that's interesting because we also had in the past 2 weeks, as we had the steepening put skew, we had the RSIs approaching 70, we had all of these, kind of flashing yellow lights. What one might say is a red light. We had Washington State passing legislation about to be signed by the governor, where a headline will tell you that we're going to ban sales of gasoline cars after 2030. If you look at Car and Driver magazine, you see it. Auto Week, Electrek, they're all calling this a ban on gas cars. And the reason we're showing you this by way of introducing our guests is to point out that if you only saw these headlines, you could easily be forgiven for saying, my goodness, in 9 years, we're not going to have any gasoline demand in the state of Washington. Well, be careful. If you actually look at the text, here is section 6, which notes that actually you need to have a road usage charge or similar tax imposed on the residents of Washington when 75% of the registered passenger and light duty vehicles are participating in said tax, yet to be defined. Then a goal is established to begin to phase out these vehicles from the model year 2030 forward. So it's kind of contingency. And then even if you do all that, this goal, which is not a law, it's a goal, does not supersede any other law that it may be inconsistent with. If you ask, okay, well, what's a passenger or light duty vehicle? Okay, well, they're on-road motor vehicles with a scale weight of up to 10,000 pounds and 3 or more wheels. This reminds me very much of Matt Portillo talking about the number of wheels on cars in India. Notice that emergency services vehicles are not passenger and light duty vehicles from the perspective of this law. Ambulances, police cars, fire trucks. Now, there may be very good reasons to do that. In fact, we may all agree, you know what, that's actually a pretty good idea. But that is not a ban on the sale or registration of ICE vehicles in the state of Washington in the 2030. And then finally, when we look at what is the input into the electric utility, the electric utility is mandated to consider the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's back to that first chart I showed. Now it's $60 per metric ton, at least on the futures exchange for 2021, $51 to $53, depending on what you're talking about with the US government and states. And yet, for the purposes of this subsection 3, gas consisting largely of methane and other hydrocarbons derived from the decomposition of organic material in landfills, wastewater treatment facilities, and anaerobic digesters must be considered a non-emitting resource. Same for qualified biomass energy, non-emitting. Now, it's definitional, it's the land of lawyers, but I think the person in the street could be forgiven for saying, if it's emitting, why are we not calling it an emission? And so there are all sorts of loopholes in this law, and perhaps one that a pro-business person or entity would like to see, these plans shall not be a basis to bring legal action against the electric utility. So there is kind of a anti-legal system abuse component to this law as well. But we thought it was kind of a nice tee up for Dick and Ryan, because this is ripped from the headlines. The headline tells you a very black and white story. And as with all laws, when you start getting into the guts of it, the story does not hold up in its very black and white form. And I think reasonable people could agree or disagree with parts of it. But with that, Maynard, let me turn it back to you.
Well, Colin, that was great. We now know what you did with a lot of your weekend. That's pretty fascinating stuff. Yeah, thanks, everybody. So let me again welcome Dick Weekley. I gave you some of the highlights up front, but Dick is a longtime Texas businessman. He's part of the Texas Business Hall of Fame. He's part of the Greater Houston Partnership. He's just been a real force in the state for business, a large part of the business community, and a big part of our community. He's done a lot of great things, like he launched the Quality of Life Coalition, which did a lot of things in Houston. I don't want to get too far ahead because all these things will start coming out. But when it comes to people who love their community and decide to get involved, Dick is the absolute prototype. So, Dick, we're delighted to have you. And again, Ryan, who works with you, we're delighted to have you too. I think, Dick, in Houston, everybody knows you and your brother have one of, I think it's the largest private home builder in the country. But when you came back from the war in Vietnam, you were just, as I understand it, just kind of looking for a job. And that's what gave birth to Weekley. But let you tell the story just to kick us off.
Well, I did get back from the Navy in 1971 and need a job. So I got a job selling real estate and was doing pretty well. Started my own company 2 years later. And then my brother got out of Trinity going to Harvard, and they made him lay out 2 years to try to get a little business experience. And he got a job with a home builder, a friend of mine. And after a couple of years, actually 18 months, he was going to make an enormous, 46 years ago, he's going to make a $200,000 bonus for a 23-year-old, which is pretty good. And they called him up and said, look, we're going to give you a bonus of a Buick. He said, yeah, that's great. But, our deal is, you're going to pay me $200,000 for doing well in my subdivision. And so David called me. He was all concerned that they had changed the deal. And he said, what do I do? And I say, you talk to everybody. You got a problem, talk to him. So he sent him a letter, went and talked to him, and they fired him. And they said, you don't like the way you run a company, you're fired. And so he called me and I said, Dick, I appreciate your advice. I took it. I got fired from my first job. My wife's pregnant. I live in one of your rent houses. Got any other ideas? And I said, well, you're running a subdivision. If you want to, you can do it for us. And so we started, each put up $500 and we started Weekley Homes. And so that was 46 years ago. And so my brother's done an amazing job. He's an amazing leader. I can brag on David because he's a CEO and, top 100 companies in America, top, last 15 years in a row. And he's just a really inspired leader. So I'm proud of him, and it continues to work. A few years after that, I started a development company, then started a few more companies until at the ripe old age of 47, I heard a guy talk about the litigation crisis in Texas. And I said, this is crazy. So anyway, that's how the building company started.
Well, so there you were. That's a great transition. You were doing a lot of business things, you were an entrepreneur, and then you, as you and I've talked about it, you had this moment where you realized what some of the legal mess was doing to the state. I'm kind of telling your story, but this is, I think it was 1994, and you said, I'm jumping in. But let me let you kind of take it from there and tell us about TLR.
So all was good. I was married at that time, had 3 kids and running 3 companies. And I was doing great and heard a guy talk about the litigation crisis in Texas, which was at the time, Texas was the worst state in the union, and opposed to, I've got a slide on this later, but as opposed to being the Texas miracle, which people look at Texas now, was really the Texas disaster. Doctors leaving the state, retiring early, companies not expanding. Lloyd's of London charged an extra 25% just for the pleasure of doing business in Texas. And it was a disaster. And I heard all this data and said, this is crazy. So then I talked to a bunch of my colleagues. I said, are you having these problems? And everybody started, saying they had incredible problems, started telling stories. And so I had a meeting of about 60 guys and to hear these stories, and the stories kept coming out. And I said, we need to go fix it. And everybody laughed and said, no, you can't fix it. The plaintiff trial lawyers on the legislature, on a lot of the courts, no way to fix it. And I said, this is nuts. I mean, you 1% liable and you end up paying 100%. Something happens in Dallas, you ends up trying a case down in the Valley. Products liability, punitive damages. Every lawsuit turns into punitive damages. I mean, this is a joke. What do you mean you can't do anything? They said, well, the plaintiff trial lawyers own the state, they own the legislature, and you just can't do anything. I just said, I don't believe that. So, it's good to be naive on certain of these things. I was totally naive and never been involved in anything like this before, but I went to Austin to talk to everybody who had been working on this project for about 20, 30 years. And there's not a one of them that said we could do anything. The Chamber of Commerce, Manufacturing Association, Texas Medical Association, Hospital Association, realtors, contractors, bankers, everybody said you can't do anything. And I just didn't believe it. So I came back to Houston and started recruiting some of my colleagues to help. Leo Lindbeck was an early partner, Dick Trabulsi, Hugh Kelly, who's General Counsel of Chiefs Lighting Power. And then Leo and I started traveling the state in Walter Mischer's plane, essentially for about 9 months, recruiting the Texas business leadership, and which we did. And then everybody said that you'll be lucky if you pass one bill, you have to negotiate with the trial lawyers. And I finally said, if I'm going to take my time away from my wife, my family, my work has to come to Austin. I wasn't going to work on one bill. I was going to work on a whole slew of them. And again, everybody laughed. You can't do anything, much less one bill. But again, not knowing any better, we proposed 8 bills. And we then got heavily involved in politics, beat 3 state senators, which, of course, back then, no one went against incumbent. We went against 3 incumbent. 2 of them were personal trial lawyers, and 1 of them voted with them. We beat all 3 of them and kind of laid the predicate. And I thought we were done, because once you get involved in politics, you elect some people that are more ideologically aligned. Everybody goes, okay, done. We've changed the law. But Leo had been done this before, and he said, Dick, you don't understand, my friend. I said, this is your ticket to the arena where the real war is in the legislature. We're about 10% of the way home. I said, oh, no, 10%. We've been working hard for a year. And so we went to the legislature and we proposed 8 bills, which again, everybody laughed at, said you never pass any of them. We ended up passing all 8 of them and came back to Houston and then turned around and I said, okay, I've done my 2 years. Back in late 1800s, early 1900s, you go to Washington for 2 years, maybe 4 years, go back home, go back to the farm. I was ready to go back to the farm, turned around and said, who's going to lead it next? Everybody said, no, Weekley, you're doing a great job. No. I said, I'd do it for 2 years. That was 28 years ago, which shows you about how smart I am about, pass the baton. But anyway, the more of the story is that we've had incredible success. We have volunteers who've chipped in all over the state, met some of the best people in the state, most patriotic, generous people in the state. Frankly, I'm not sure we could have done this in another state if I was in, Michigan, Iowa, whatever. But Texas is so generous and so, can-do attitude that we went and we did it. And that's been exhibited in other projects I've been involved in Texas. But this is by far the biggest and has made the biggest impact on the state.
I mean, I think all of us do in today's Texas. You always feel, I know I do. You just feel really proud of the state and how well it's doing and some of the how it leads on policies. It's hard to imagine that 26 years ago it was mired down in a lot of anti-growth policies. I think I know you remember it vividly. I think for the rest of us and for everybody who's coming to Texas every day, it's kind of hard to imagine that vision of what it used to be like.
Well, it's taken a lot of work by a lot of people over a long period of time. And the key thing is when you work with these politicians and they take tough votes and they know that they're going to have opponents in the next election, you gotta have their back. You got to back them up. If people take tough votes to do the right thing for their communities, then you got to be there behind them. And lots of times it doesn't happen. People come up, Ray, we got to pass these bills. You pass a few bills, and then they go back home and they get challenged and they get defeated. And that hadn't happened for 27 years. We've had their back. As a result of that, people trust us. We always give them all the data, all the good, all the bad, not much bad, but all the good, all the bad, all the arguments for and against, respectfully ask for their vote. And typically, if you've done your homework, which we always do, typically people will look at the data and decide to vote in favor of a reform.
Well, I mentioned another thing here in Houston that you'd done, similar kind of thing, problem, grab it, get some friends, attack it, the Quality of Life Coalition. I think people would find it interesting if you could talk about that a little bit. I know it's been great for Houston in so many ways.
So a couple years after that, I was on the Greater Houston Partnership Board and in one of these meetings, and we started seeing all these ads in the Bush-Gore presidential race, and it was portraying Houston as a garbage pit. They had sludge going into channels, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, I've had enough of this. We gotta change something. And about the same time, a friend of mine, Ann Lentz, had retired from Vincent Elkins as a partner, raised her kids, and said, Dick, we got to do something to enhance this city. And so Ann and I created something called the Quality of Life Coalition. Then we started recruiting CEOs and entrepreneurs to help us. We recruited about 10 other folks. We recruited people that were serious business people, but also were doers, not just sitting someplace making decisions, but actually did stuff. So, for example, recruited Chuck Carlberg, who was head of Reese Carlberg, to do all our media, press relations, press conferences, et cetera. Then we recruited Max Watson, who at the time was chairman of BMC Software, to take care of our signage and billboards. We recruited Max Watson, who was an international oil and gas consultant. He came in and took care of trees. Anyway, so we recruited a bunch of Bill White. He was concerned about the urban heat island. He spent his own money and went and got the Berkeley Labs to do a study on Houston, see how we could mitigate the urban heat island. So we had 10 very serious business people. We met in my office, my conference room. We didn't even have a bank account, but we put together about $650 million over the next 18 years to do about 5 major things: to build 150 hiking trails of hike and bike trails along the major bios of Texas. We had started, and then we merged with the Parks Board. Tom Bacon, incredible executive, had his own hedge fund, private real estate. And he came up with what it was going to cost us to finish the hike and bike trails in the city and in the county. And both of them was like 490 million, but the city itself was 210 million. So we said, let's take bite number one, the city. We upped the city to a bond issue for 100 million. The Kenders put up 50 million, others put up about 10 million each. We end up raising about 215 million. And this year, 20 years later, we'll finish 150 miles of hike and bike trails along all the major bios in the city. And I'm not sure anything like that's been done in the country. Another one, you probably aren't aware of it, but there are many areas of town where there are abandoned lots. We had 80,000, if you can imagine, abandoned lots where they had tires, old refrigerators, old sofas. Kind of hard to clean up a neighborhood when we have abandoned lots and no one owns it. So we took that on, and after changing a few laws and talking to judges, we ended up foreclosing on 1,000 a month versus 1 or 2 a month, trying to clean up. Bill White did a lot with this when he was mayor. And same thing with signage and billboards. We created city districts in downtown and on the way to the airports. Obviously, that needs a lot more work. But anyway, it was a massive undertaking. And we also wanted to reforest the freeways and the verges. You can see a lot of trees along the freeways haven't finished, but that was a huge effort that we started, put a lot of money into that. Again, trying to transform the city. It was a big effort. Here, once again, it's a bunch of volunteers who spend their own time, their own money getting together. So we're going to do something. We outlined a process, and we got with it. And 20 years, again, it takes persistence, right? This is a 20-year project. But 20 years later, I think we've had a huge impact in the city. 28 years later in tort reform, we've passed the most comprehensive set of lawsuit reforms in the history of the country. And what is it? Basically a bunch of volunteers getting together. And then obviously you got to hire seasoned professionals and lobbyists and media people and lawyers and all this. But it's just going to work, getting a plan, and then executing.
Well, Dick, Colin and I were exchanging messages this weekend, knowing we were going to get to talk to you. And, in our world today, there's so much discussion about ESG, and really more broadly, are companies, good? Are they helping? What are companies' roles in society? And this just seems like the stuff that you and your business partners were doing is just, hey, grab a rake, grab a shovel, grit your checkbook. Let's clean up, let's make this town better. And, we're not waiting on anybody. So it's kind of like old school ESG,
Right.
or ESG before ESG was cool. I don't know. That's, I might have to start calling you the first ESG warrior. It's really
The Arnold's
impressive.
called and they wanted to start an education, a Texans for Education Reform, which we did. We've created another group and I recruited a good board, former state George W. Bush, Rod, Education Secretary. What am I thinking about? Rod Page, recruited him, created the former chairman of the Education Committee in the Senate, Lawrence Shapiro, Woody Hunt, a big guy that's on the Board of Regents at UT. We got together, a group of about 10 guys, went to Austin and did a lot of work in the education reform. That's not nearly finished. Got a lot of more work to do. But I've frankly gone back and spend my time on some of these other projects I've been working on. But that's, in fact, one of the new guys from California that I've been meeting with, Joe Lonsdale, bringing his 8 companies to Texas. And he's passionate about keeping Texas, Texas. And he's a new recruit. He's young. He's passionate, he's wealthy, and he wants to get with it and keep Texas, Texas. So had a meeting with another guy last week who'd come to Texas, same thing, trying to, sold his company, made a lot of money, came to Texas and wants to keep Texas, Texas. So there's some new young talent coming in and we need it because the founders of TLR, Leo died 4 years ago, and the three of the founders are all 75 years of age. So it's TLR is a very, very important of the infrastructure, political infrastructure of Texas. And we just got to find a way to, quote, sustainable to sustain TLR by bringing in new younger folks, which we're trying to do.
I thought the example you gave about abandoned lots was a really, it's an interesting one because we've all seen those and thought, gosh, we should clean that up. And you commented on, getting with the judges, getting with, kind of working the system so that everybody understood what was necessary. And then, you took it from just a couple lots being seized quickly and cleaned up to, tons of them. That just showed, I think it was for me, it really informs how you think about, you see a problem, you see a kind of a legal administrative blockage to the problem, and then you just get in there and make it happen. I just love that example. Maybe we can use that example to start talking about TLR a little more formally and some of the things you guys have been pushing to make the state a great place for business.
I'll give you one more example. So what we found out is that let's say there's a abandoned lot and you go in and you find out, you look at the title. Well, somebody died intestate, which means with no will, and they got 50 heirs. So what you do, you got to spend money to advertise around the country. And what happens is judges want to move their cases. And so there's a condemnation case to get rid of it. And so you can't ever find these heirs. And so a year and a half goes by and you're just about ready to start to try to put it back into production. The judge wants to clear his case. And so he clears the case and you got to start all over again, 2 or 3 years later. I mean, it's a disaster. It's crazy. So we went and had talk to the judges. And then we had, before we started that, if somebody could reclaim it 10 years later, well, who's going to buy it, not do anything for 10 years? And we had to change the statute of limitations where, after 2 years you could do it. So there's just a lot of different things. You had to talk to the judges, you had to change the law, you had to do, but you figure out what you need to do to fix a problem, and then you go fix it. And it just takes a lot of different pieces, but you just go fix it. But it's not it's just work, basically. It's a lot of work.
Yeah,
okay, so you want to get into the slides?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's show the folks your slides.
Okay, so Ryan, we'll start with, so we've already talked about the first slide a little bit. 1994, out of control lawsuits. Out of control lawsuits, companies not expanding, doctors retiring early, leaving Texas. Next slide, please, Ryan. What we did, there were a lot of groups out there at the time trying to work on this, but a lot of them were C3s, which is great. You can educate, you can do legal research, you can do market research, but you can't pass laws. There's another pretty big group, a bunch of trade associations, it was a lobby group. But back then, lobbyists just didn't want to make anyone mad. They tried to negotiate, but the trial lawyers had this huge honeypot, and they didn't want to change anything. So just lobbying wasn't working. So we created not only a C3, but also a C6 with a lobby team, legal team, media team, PR team, grassroots, et cetera, coalitions. But we also created a very influential political action committee, which today is the largest PAC in the state in terms of spending money on races. So we really have all three pieces, which I think is really important if you're going to do systemic change. Next slide, please.
Hey, Dick, can I just ask you a question
Sure.
on that previous slide? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Do you mind just, I think people, they get what a PAC is, but a C3 and a C6, do you mind explaining that?
Sure. So a C3 is a charitable contribution. It's like Herman Hospital or Baylor. If you want to give money to a C3, it's you can take a tax write-off, and so we have a C3 to do legal research and economic research, and so that's the easiest money to raise. That's the smallest piece of what we do. C6 or C4 or C6. This is basically an advocacy group, and you want to go and change a law, so you go in and lobby the members of the legislature. You got to have a legal team to go and draft all the legislation, prepare witnesses for the hearings. Media, in our case, the media is pretty much biased in favor of the plaintiffs or the victims. So we have to try to explain to the media that these are really balanced laws, trying to make common sense reforms. Public relations, you got to have a public relations team, grassroots. You need really people in the various towns and grass tops, the civic leaders. If I have a senator from Dallas or Abilene, we can have lobbyists go in, but when a Ray Hunt or Harlan Crow or a Bob Rowling or Ross Perot call folks in Austin, it's much more impactful than if a lobbyist talks to them. Or in Abilene, if I have Tucker Bridwell call them, or in El Paso, we have a Woody Hunt call them, or in Dallas, a John Zachary. I mean, the list goes on. You need serious business people on your side to try to penetrate, all of the activity in the legislative session, tell them this is serious. And then finally, I learned very, very early on, you talk to people in the legislature about a reform, and if your opponent, and even if they're inclined to support, if the plaintiff trial lawyers are giving them $200,000 or $300,000, and we're in here telling them trying to do what's good, you're kind of at a disadvantage, and they'll nod politely. But basically, you need to have people ideologically aligned to try to reform and have it a pro-business state. And once you have that, either Republican or Democrat, we supported them, and it made a huge difference. And we basically changed the state over the first maybe 15 years. And we've had a very strong pro-business state ever since. Our pro-business state used to be Democrat. Now the pro-business state is Republican. But again, in each case, we support pro-business Democrats today in the legislature that will have the courage to vote with their constituents and stand up to the plaintiff trial lawyers who are trying to threaten them with primary opponents. Does that kind of explain the three different groups?
Yes, sir, it does.
So you can take corporate money and support the C6, and there's personal after-tax money that supports the PACs. So the interesting thing about this slide is that we're really the entire business community, other than the personage of trial lawyers. I mean, every different kind of business we've got supporting us all across the state, 900 different cities. So it really is the broad swath of the Texas business community. Next slide. The important thing about this is that this is really a marathon. It is not a sprint. We're now a national model. People come to Texas all the time. How in the world did you guys do this? And I tell them the way we did it, it was the volunteers. You have to have volunteers that lead this. We're immune to the threats that we all got. But the bottom line is, you can see, starting in 1995, the first 8 reforms. These are just a few of the 80 plus reforms we passed every year. Almost every year we've had major reforms. Last year, for example, we passed 8 major tort reforms, but then we helped 15 other allies of ours who had reforms important to the state and that we helped them because we thought it was going to help the state. So it's the organization has evolved from just tort reform to being really kind of pro-business.
So Dick, can I just ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
It seems like, I'm just thinking of other states that are unfortunately, their reputation is they're not business friendly, and it's really hard to get stuff done, and it's really hard to get things permitted, and things take forever and all that stuff. And then here's Texas. It seems like the secret sauce, if you will, and of course, secret sauce is people like you who give up so much of their time and energy and money. But you've really opened the communication channel all across the state, right into the legislature. And then you have a legislature that's listening.
Right.
Because, again, people like you have gone and found candidates who understand all this stuff, whether they're red or blue or in between. And that's sort of it's the communication, it's the people who are listening, it's the people who understand this, how this all works if you really want more jobs and more business. I'm just looking at it going, it's so special and it's working, but is that the right way to think about it? Is you've just got the communication flowing and it's flowing to the right people?
Well, again, going back to work, right? It's just a lot of work. You got to go to Tyler. You got to go to Midland. You got to go to Abilene. You got to go to El Paso. You got to go to, Laredo. You got to go to McAllen. You got to just recruit the business leaders, and then they have to be willing to work. But looking at the slide, I'll just give you a couple of examples. So in 2007, we had no interest, really at the time, we had no idea that the maritime was a problem. Well, the harbors, maritime is about 15% of the entire state economy. And what happened is that just a couple of trial lawyers started pulling people from the Gulf Coast down to the valley and started having these outrageous lawsuits. And so what was happening is that as a result of this, typically if they go into dredge like a Corpus or a Brownsville or whatever, a typical dredging project might be 2 or 3 million, and these bids started coming back 8 or 9 million. Well, the Corps of Engineers didn't have the money to float the contracts. And so these harbors weren't getting dredged. So having spent time and money in the Navy, I can tell you that they were having to anchor ships offshore in Brownsville and lighter them. That means take off cargo in the open sea to get them light enough to get into the channel. Very, very dangerous to do in the open water when the ship's moving back and forth in the waves. But that's what they were having to do because they couldn't dredge their channel. So we worked with the dredgers. There were only there were 8 of them. One had already left the state. 3 of them were looking at leaving the state. So we were trying to keep our dredgers. So we passed a bill that basically solved that problem. And the lawsuits went from, a modest amount just off the top. And after passing this bill, they went back down to normal. But that's just an example of something that comes up that we've got to go solve, and there's no one else to solve it. The dredgers, there's 7 dredging companies. No way they could go take on the plaintiff trial lawyers and reform that bill. You look at last session, 2017, there was this huge rash of hail lawsuits across the country, and they went from like 2 or 3 or 4 per city per year to like 300 or 400. I mean, it's just unbelievable, the spike. And so we had to go in and we had to reform that. And it was starting to impact the insurance markets. Today, right now, there's a huge trucking crisis. We just passed a bill with bipartisan support last Thursday evening through the House to try to reform the trucking industry, which is impacting insurance markets around the country, not just trucking, but insurance. My son owns a flooring company. He called me. He said, God, my liability rates went up 24%. I called my insurance guy. I said, what the hell's going on? He said, well, all these trucking lawsuits, we're raising premiums in order to cover our losses in the trucking lawsuit. So the bottom line is same thing with big apartment guy. He called me and didn't know what was going on. And so if you have one industry that starts getting hit, starts impacting all the industries. So sorry for going down these funny trails, but that's kind of how it works.
It sounds like usually a warning sign is something, there's a pinch point and a cost explosion is usually
Right.
a signal something's wrong. Okay,
Right.
let me let you keep going.
Okay. So we had 16. So in 2004, well, first of all, the governor, lieutenant governor, the speaker called and said, "Hey, Weekley, TLR, you got to help us register voters." I said, "Why?" He said, "We've been losing this registration battle." And they called me in 2018 or 2019 at the beginning of it. And you can see the Democrat line at the top, Republican line at the bottom. And we've been losing the registration battle for the last really 9 years. Only went back 9 years. But obviously, if this continued, we turn into a blue state. So the governor, lieutenant governor meeting, and the speaker had a couple meetings at my request. We invited some people in, 30 days, raised about 12.5 million, got engaged, hired a bunch of folks, and started registering voters. And you can see that even starting halfway through the year, we cut the bleeding from 241,000 to 21,000. This is only through last March. We were plus 18,000. We were recruiting more Republicans every month than the Democrats were. Basically, we wanted to just stop the bleeding, and we're able to do that. But again, it takes effort, organization, and money. So next slide. Huh?
And Dick, if you don't mind, this would be a great place for us to, hit on this issue, which is, in today's world, there's no issue that doesn't become red and blue. It's ridiculous, how everything gets kind of cast that way. You've ended up, and I'll just steal your thunder, but only a little, because we're in this red-blue thing. And I think the point I'm trying to make is, and you'll make it better than me, is you're out to support pro-business candidates regardless of party.
Right.
It just so happens, at least, there's a correlation between the parties a little bit, on one correlated with pro-business, the other less so. But you're nonpartisan in that sense. You're pro-business. They just happen to have been more red than they've been blue, if that's a fair way to say it.
Well, 40 years ago, Texas was pro-business. It was Democrat. Today, it's pro-business and Republican. But we support Republicans and Democrats. But candidly, we're much more Republican today than Democrat, because more Republicans are pro-business than Democrats. And unfortunately, the radical left has taken over much of the party. Unfortunately, we used to have very competent, moderate Democrats. We have still some today, but not nearly as many as we used to. And I'll show you in the slides we're about to get to the Democrats that we supported this last session, who have the courage to vote for the constituents and for the business community, for the constituents, for small business, and stand up to the plaintiff trial lawyers, which is important. If they have the courage to do that, we'll support them. And then the next slide will show you the Democrats that we supported heavily. One of these folks was a black minister from Dallas. We not only supported his campaign, we ran his campaign for him, but he was a pro-business Democrat, and we supported them heavily. Go to the next slide in the Texas Senate. We had, out of 31 senators, Texas had 19. We lost one. The governor, lieutenant governor, and TLR had picked up Pete Flores in a special election. Pete Flores was the first Hispanic Republican in the state Senate ever, which we need to change. But he was the first Republican Hispanic in the Senate. He was the first Republican to hold the seat in 150 years. With Trump on the ticket, it was very tough to hold this seat in Southwest Texas. He lost that seat, but we did pick up, or did not pick up, but we did win Eddie Lucio's seat, Democrat in Southeast Texas. And he's the most conservative pro-business Democrat in the Senate. We've been his biggest supporter for years. He had an AOC type Democrat that would have created havoc in the Texas State Senate. So we weighed in very, very heavily with Eddie, and Eddie won. He won in the runoff, which was scary, but he won it. He actually won, so that helped us in the Senate. So now we have 18 out of 31, still a modest majority in the state Senate. And again, even though we support these Democrats, they know that without a Republican majority, we couldn't pass a lot of these pro-business bills that we need to pass. but they know that if they vote pro-business, that we're going to be there for them and support them.
Sure. Well, thank you, Dick. And I'm going to throw it open to the team. Colin, I was going to toss the ball to you.
Yeah, I guess, Dick, when you look at legislation and you're thinking about cleaning up pollution from the code, what do you look for in laws? Are there some specific best practices that you like to see, or some specific, maybe not mistakes, but things that in your experience you've learned tend to lead to lawsuits and then maybe not a great outcome for anybody? It just becomes an expensive legal mess and you get that empty lot for 10 years.
So it's an insightful question, and basically a couple of things. One is that these plaintiff trial lawyers are incredibly creative. They're very smart, and so every cycle, every election cycle, or every legislative cycle, we've got to read every single bill, because they will add a clause or a paragraph innocuously to a bill that will create a new cause of action, a new theory of liability, and which would create the kind of lawsuits we're talking about, or that they can take an existing law, like this existing law, like on hail, for example, which we had to fix a couple of years ago. The doctors in 2003, the insurers are not compensating them quickly enough, and they maybe wait 5 or 6 months. And some of these small medical practices are not getting paid timely, which they should be, because doctors shouldn't be carrying an insurance company's receivables, right? So part of the medical liability reform, which we did, said that the doctors needed to reimburse the doctors in a more timely fashion. If they don't, then there's a penalty, a fine. And I mean, doubling up, there's got to be a penalty to ensure that they pay them timely. So what happened is that about 10 years later, the trial lawyers saw this big hole to drive through, and they started using this timeliness, for example, when a hurricane hits. So if a hurricane hits, which they did, like in Katrina, whatever, then all of a sudden you get 215,000, 20,000 lawsuits. And if you don't settle these lawsuits in 30 days, you got these outrageous penalties. So this was a huge hole. And so what happened is that these penalties started racking up, and the trial lawyers got a huge percentage of them. And so they would wait 2 years to file a lawsuit. The penalties built up like crazy. And then all of a sudden, a simple $20,000 fix on a roof turns into a $500,000 lawsuit, which is $500,000 lawsuit in the problem. But when they have adjusters going out and recruiting thousands of people to file a claim on a roof, it becomes unbearable, and the insurance market was exploding. So we had to go in and do a fix on that case. And so what we did, we fixed something for the medical community, and these very creative guys found a hole to drive a truck through, which they did. So we had to go back in and fix it. So again, either it's one, back in the very beginning, back in 2000, in the early 90s or 80s, what happened is we had a Texas Supreme Court that was filled with personal injury trial lawyers that invalidated hundreds of years of common law. I mean, just common law that from opinions and judicial rulings, they basically overruled it. And so there are a bunch of things that we had to go fix that were overturned during the time when the plaintiff lawyers owned the Texas Supreme Court. So, but that hadn't happened recently, because the Texas Supreme Court now administers and adheres to law as it is written, not how they want it to be. So we don't have the problems with the Supreme Court as we used to, but we still have the problem of sneaking provisions in bills that we have to watch out for every single session. And we have to go fix things that come up year after year. And there's some perennial problems that we've got that we have to continue chipping away at every year to try to improve the law to make it better. Does that answer your question, Colin?
It does. And I think it illustrates something that maybe bears repeating, that the emphasis here isn't just on big companies, it's on all companies, big and small. And one example that came up in the course of our research was you flagged a case of a small dry cleaner who did lose a pair of pants for a customer and was sued $54 million for damages. And, I think we can all kind of understand that, yes, there probably was, an issue there, a responsibility, but was it a $54 million kind of responsibility? And I think that just is an important point to make, that this is not about just dredging the ship channel, not just big multinational corporations. It's all business at all levels.
I'll give you one key story that highlights that also, Colin. Back in the early days, when I was traveling around the state, in 1994, I met a guy named Figueroa. He's about an 80-year-old doctor. He had 8 kids, and all of them were Ivy League graduates. And his daughter was a graduate from Harvard Medical School, and she was 40 years old. And she was giving half her care away to indigent patients who couldn't pay her anything. And so they had this very, very talented physician spending her time on the border with indigents at no pay. And after she got 3 different lawsuits from people whose lives they saved, suing her, she finally said, I'm done. She quit. She just quit. And that's what was happening along the border. I mean, you can't, I'm not sure there was a doctor in South Texas that didn't have lawsuits against them. It wasn't a case of how competent they were, incompetent, but they had no obstetricians, no neurosurgeons, to speak of, and no telling how many lives were lost. There's an accident, you got to fly to Austin someplace to get a neurosurgeon. So this was a huge, huge problem. And that's kind of another example of what you just said, 52 million on a pants. This was, doctors. In fact, a good friend of mine, I mentioned earlier, Max Watson, was chairman of BMC Software. His daughter-in-law is a cardiovascular surgeon. She was doing a residency down in Galveston. And the surgeons were trying to tell her at the early stages of tort reform, don't become a surgeon. You get sued like crazy. don't become a surgeon. She said, well, I really want to become a surgeon. They said, don't do it. That was the climate. One last example, then we'll get on. The Texas Medical Center in Houston, the largest in the world, was having to pay bounties to get doctors to come to Texas. Bounties, $250,000. Now, there was such a flood of doctors coming to Texas that the legislature actually had to fund them an extra $5 million, because to get approved to come to Texas went from a week approval to a year approval. So they had to get more money to approve doctors. So the change was just night and day after we passed these reforms.
Well, this has been fascinating, Dick. We really appreciate you coming on. I think we want to encourage people to check out Texas for lawsuit reform. Go to the website, TLR. It's all there. Dick, as I was making some notes ahead of today, I was really struck by, in talking to you, first of all, people who love their community, and that's you. So on behalf of Houston and Texas, you love your community, and you've dedicated so much of your life to it. You're pro-business, you're pro-Texas, you're all about solving problems. And I think that the thing you said to me is, hey, get involved. Nobody's going to solve it for you. Just go do it. And if we're really going to do this Texas sustainability thing that we want to do, we all got to think like that. So thank you for your time, and thank you for all your efforts.
Well, Maynard, appreciate you and appreciate your team there. And again, it takes people of goodwill all over the state to chip in. So thanks, Maynard. Appreciate it.